Mark Lamont Hill, like most black Christians in America, is an Orientalist, an Islamophobe, and a Zionist grifter. And he's a massive dick rider who runs cover for Martin Luther King. Yeah, the Zionist Martin Luther King, who we should not be celebrating, right? Right? Look at the headline. MLK was not a Zionist. The truth about MLK and the Zionist entity. So MLK actually, sadly, was a liberal Zionist. Now look at what he said. Look at his apologia and the cover he ran for the Zionist entity. Right? This is who MLK was. MLK was a Zionist clown. MLK was an Orientalist. MLK was an Islamophobe. Right? This is who MLK was. Again, I'm Palestinian, right? My maternal grandpa was Palestinian. His family originated, most of his family originated in the town of Daliat al-Karmal in the north of Palestine, and in Isfia, which is a suburb of Daliat al-Karmal. I also have family from Al-Khalil in the West Bank. I have family from occupied 1948 Palestine and from the West Bank, right? So that's my maternal grandpa's lineage, right? So as a Palestinian who was born and raised in the United States, as someone that's part of the Palestinian diaspora, to hear this circus clown, Mark Lamont Hill, running cover for and dick riding Zionist Martin Luther King, because that's what it is. He's a little dick rider for Martin Luther King. And then when you do further research on Mark Lamont Hill, and you find that he authored a book with Zionist Mitchell Plitnick. Now, who is Mitchell Plitnick? I'm going to go back a screen here. Mitchell Plitnick is a grifter and a Zionist think tanker. Two screens, right? This is who Mitchell Plitnick is, right? He's been a Zionist think tanker all his life. Again, he did his undergrad at University of California. Did his grad school at the University of Maryland. So check it. Bachelor of Arts, Near East and Middle Eastern Studies, Masters of Public Policy Management, International Security. He worked at JVP and was their co-director and director of education and policy. He worked at B'Tselem, the Zionist think tank, as their director. He worked at the Foundation for Middle East Peace as their director, right? And writer, co-author with Mark Lamont Hill, Progressive Except for Palestine, right? And it's kind of sketchy because here's the thing, man. Check out who he has ties to. So you can see this on the screen here. So this is Mike Amitai, who Plitnick has endorsed. Guess who he works for? The Open Societies Foundation, right? That's George Soros. That's Zionist George Soros. No, I will not. See, I just use LinkedIn for my research, my opposition research. So check this out. This is who Amitai is, right? He works for the Open Societies Foundation, which is... No, Melissa. I don't know why that popped up on my screen. Which is the organization of George Soros. And he previously worked at the London School of Economics and Political Science, right? That's pretty sus there. That's hella suspicious, right? So he works for the U.S. Open Society Foundation, Advocacy Director for Middle East and North Africa, right? And that's literally George Soros. And he literally admits to doing imperialism and war crimes and settler colonialism, right? But not in those exact words, right? Now, before that, he previously worked at the director for the Washington, I'm assuming it's Washington, D.C., Kurdish Institute. And then he worked as a professional staff member for the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, and he led commission oversight of Turkey, Greece, and Cyprus in domestic USA compliance with the Helsinki Accord. So this guy is a grifter, and he went to the London School of Economics and Political Science and Brown University. And you want to know who gave him endorsements? None other than Mitchell Plitnick. So that's the first red flag about Zionist Mark Lamont Hill. Second red flag is this video, right? Third red flag, so we'll play this video here.
Because he'd be voting for Trump right now. Every year we have all of this stuff happening, and it's no different when it comes to the question of Israel and Palestine. People say Dr. King was a Zionist.
So why are you playing both sides of the question of Palestine and the Zionist entity? No, it's Palestine from river to sea, you moron. You Zionist moron, you academic. Oh, and check it out. Mark Lamont Hill went to Morehouse College, which is like a bougie HBCU, right? Mark Lamont Hill, this Generation X grifter, this Gen X grifter, because that's what he is, man. He's this Zionist Gen X grifter. And this is why you can't trust the Green Party, because they have Zionists like Mark Lamont Hill. Get this. He graduated from Temple University for undergrad and then grad school, University of Pennsylvania. And he's an academic, commentator, and an author. The guy's never worked a real job in his life as an adult. Mark Lamont Hill, you know, the friend of Kobe Bryant, the Zionist grifter who collaborated with Zionist Mitchell Plitnick, never worked a real job in his life. You know, I've worked in grocery, I've worked in produce. I'm a working class guy. Mark Lamont Hill is an academic grifter and a Zionist dick rider and a Zionist, Orientalist, Islamophobic clown who's never worked a real job in his life.
And Dr. King affirmed Israel's right to exist. And Dr. King right now would be standing with Israel and not with
MLK was a Zionist. MLK was an Islamophobe. MLK was an Orientalist. Right? MLK is what we would call a black Islamophobe, a black Orientalist, right? So this is by Axios, right? It's by who did this article? Russell Contreras did this article. So this is by Russell Contreras. And you find out that MLK was a Zionist, right? MLK was a Zionist, right? So MLK, and that's why Haj Malik al-Shabazz, rahimahullah, called MLK an Uncle Tom, right? MLK was a Zionist. Zero excuses. Zero excuses. Because, guys, I'm Palestinian. My maternal grandpa was Palestinian. I don't play games with Zionists. Right? I don't play games at all. So, Mark Lamont Hill is a Zionist clown. MLK was a Zionist. Mark Lamont Hill is dick riding for MLK in a major way.
Peace, family. It's your brother Mark Lamont Hill, the Palestinian people, and they tried to marshal Dr. King's legacy and his vision, his speeches, his ideas, what he said and what he didn't say, as evidence to support their claims about Dr. King and Israel-Palestine.
So why are you saying, so he normalized the Zionist entity because he's a clown. He's a Zionist clown and a dick rider for Martin Luther King. Second of all, why are you promoting a literal Zionist? Martin Luther King was a literal Zionist. Like, he was a Zionist. Like, the fact that Martin Luther King ran cover for the Zionist entity and Zionist squatters and espoused a Islamophobic, Orientalist, Zionist worldview, that shows that Martin Luther King is a Zionist, and that tells you everything you should know about Martin Luther King. Right?
And we've gotten to a point now where it is so far from the truth.
Again, lying. Mark Lamont Hill, who's friends with Zionist grifter Mitchell Plitnick, who's friends with George Soros associate Mike Amitai. Oops, wrong video. Just made a video about that. Runs cover for Martin Luther King. Mark Lamont Hill is probably one of the biggest dick riders of Martin Luther King.
It is so far from what actually happened. It is so far from what Dr. King's fundamental moral vision is. That some of y'all are out here arguing that Dr. King will be supporting the genocide of the Palestinian people in Gaza right now.
Look at his words, dude. MLK was a Zionist. MLK was a Zionist, right? MLK ran cover for the Zionist entity. MLK ran cover for Zionist squatters. That's what MLK was. Mark Lamont Hill is a Zionist clown.
Right now. It's mind-boggling. We have literally put a green screen on Martin Luther King Jr. and made him whatever we want him to be. And it's very, very dangerous. So what I'm here to do today is to break down why Dr. King was not a Zionist. I'm also here to break down what Dr. King's actual politics were on Israel and Palestine.
Notice how he normalizes the Zionist entity. Also, and if you want to see... So, check this out. So, liberal Zionist Mark Lamont Hill supports a binational democratic state, and he opposes extraditing Zionist squatters. Mark Lamont Hill is a grifter. Mark Lamont Hill is a circus clown. Mark Lamont Hill is a Zionist, an Islamophobe, and an Orientalist.
And to help us think about what that might mean for the big picture, and the big picture for me is figuring out how to get justice in Israel, how to get justice in Palestine, how to get justice around.
Notice how he constantly normalizes the Zionist entity. Mark Lamont Hill is a liberal Zionist clown and an academic. He's an enemy of the people, right? And I want to highlight some comments. So, the masculinist POV. The Zionist question is where I start questioning Dr. King as opposed to Malcolm X, rahimahullah. The consistency of Malcolm was incredible. The Zionist question contradicts all what Dr. King stood for, even at the time. And then, I'm not Mephisto says he's trying to gaslight us. But in the context of the existence of the Zionist entity is different than it now. There was no apartheid wall, Hamas didn't exist, the world was different, and he didn't have any access. Yeah, Mark Lamont Hill is gaslighting. I don't even know what boule is, but America's dying so slowly says, spot on. You're spot on. MLK was boule, just as Mark Lamont Hill is. Not sure what boule is. What else are people saying? Phoebe Smith is a clown. Phoebe Smith 70 is probably some Gen X clown. You can see that there's some big time dick riders of MLK and Mark Lamont Hill here in the comments. Samantha says, I'm not convinced that MLK wasn't a Zionist, though I imagine he would have changed his views over time. You can't trust these black Protestants. And the reason why is because they're Protestant, right? Protestantism is an extension of Zionism. I've seen a pattern of black Protestants in America espousing Orientalist, Zionist, and Islamophobic views. And it's a big problem, right? And so check this. So Samantha talks about Palestinians living in occupied 1948 Palestine. Like, so basically most of my relatives in Palestine, aside from the branch that's from Al Khalil. So check this. It says, it also ignores the fact that Palestinians who were living in occupied 1948 Palestine lived under martial law until 1966 and could have had their land and homes confiscated from them under present absentee laws. Yeah, MLK was a Zionist. So the truth says So, I'm not Mephisto, said he literally supported the right of the Zionist entity to exist, man. This is a stretch to the point that I think you're trying to gaslight us. That doesn't mean he'd support an apartheid state. He died before the Zionist entity took its final form in 2006. Saying that he's not a Zionist at the time is exactly the opposite of what he said. Exactly. So, interesting. So this is from a South African. Now, South Africa... South Africa is a settler colony. Right? And he says, as a South African, we will have to admit to have never thought of any American leaders of human rights in the international scope. I'm a South African, so our liberation system. Yeah, okay. But Hassam says, great outpost democracy, MLK speech. LOL. Laugh louder. Are you blind or kidding? Mark, stop your nonsense to cover up. Call it as it is. Black members is a Zionist clown. Hella people running cover for Zionist Mark Lamont Hill and Zionist MLK.
I don't know what. I'm looking at the comment section. I'm already getting hit with the trolls. I'm already getting hit with the Zionist trolls. But don't worry about the trolls, y'all. Don't feed them. Let's ignore them as much as possible. And do as I say, not as I do, because I might clap back at a couple of them, but don't worry about it. Y'all don't do that. Instead, what I want y'all to do is hit that like button right now, because when you do that, you drown out the trolls. You hit the like button and lets the algorithm know that we matter. So while they might be saying they disagree and they hate what I'm talking about, your presence in this room and you hitting that like button will do that. In the meantime, also, while you hit the like button, if you haven't subscribed to the channel.
See, he's a clout chaser, man. Because we know MLK was a Zionist. We know MLK supported genocide in Palestine, right? MLK, in his own words, said that he supported genocide in Palestine, right?
So, happy Martin Luther King Day. Happy Martin Luther King Day. Today, of course, is the birthday, the official birthday, the actual birthday, as well as the legal holiday in the United States of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And on this day, we of course want to remember Dr. King's legacy. We want to remember Dr. King's vision. Here in the United States, we spend a lot of time.
We're right here, right?
As well. Drop your comments in. First, drop your location, and I want people all around the world to be watching this. So drop your comments in, and let me know what you think. All right. So let's start. Dr. King, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. At his core, believed in freedom, in justice, in self-determination, dignity.
And by running cover for Martin Luther King, Mark Lamont Hill has exposed himself as a liberal Zionist, an Orientalist, and an Islamophobe.
Ultimately, justice for everyone. There's no doubt about that. And Dr. King certainly believed in the safety, dignity, self-determination, and freedom of the Jewish people. Dr. King,
fake doctor, not a real doctor, not an MD. Okay, Martin Luther King was a Zionist clown, right? This is what he said. This is what his words were. Martin Luther King ran cover for the Zionist entity and ran cover for Zionist squatters. Mark Lamont Hill is a liberal Zionist. Mark Lamont Hill writes books with liberal Zionists. Mitchell Plitnick has ties to George Soros, right? The guy who wrote the book with Mark Lamont Hill, he has ties to George Soros vis-a-vis Mike Amitai, right? This is who Mike Amitai is. This is who Mitchell Plitnick is, right? Let's see. And he even brags about his book on LinkedIn, right? Nope. There we go. So, liberal Zionist Mitchell Plitnick is a think tanker. He worked at the vice president as a vice president for Foundation for the Middle East. B'Tselem director, that's a Zionist think tank. He worked for Zionist think tank Jewish Voice for Peace as director of education and policy co-director. He went to University of Maryland School of Public Policy, got a master's degree in public policy management and international security, and a bachelor's of arts from the University of California in the Near East and Middle Eastern studies with a primary focus on Palestine, including honors thesis on the Zionist entity and Jewish, right? He has ties to deep state Zionist think tanker Matt Duss, Zionist Roseanne Marmor, Zionist Gila Servitsky, Zionist Cindy Levitt, Zionist Lincoln Schlensky, Zionist Joelyn Kaiser, Zionist Penny Rosenwasser, Zionist Henri Picciotto, and Zionist B. Eric Stark, right? And yeah, check out who his connections are. Angela Rye, Gila Servitsky, and is Angela Rye, wasn't she on like NBC or something? I don't know. And then Mike Amitai, who literally works for George Soros. And also worked for the Washington Kurdish Foundation. Deep state operative. That's a deep state operative if I ever knew one, right? And Plitnick also wrote a book with Mark Lamont Hill, you know, the liberal Zionist grifter, right?
Of course, they come up in the civil rights movement. He had close allies in the civil rights movement, close allies in the NAACP with whom he had worked, and other movements. He had marched through the South with Jewish Americans in particular, and so
he pranced around with Zionists, and that's why, and the fact that MLK was an Islamophobe and an Orientalist. And now Mark Lamont Hill is being a little Zionist dick rider for MLK, because that's what Mark Lamont Hill is. He's a little Zionist grifter, Zionist dick rider.
He was very familiar, very, very familiar with Jewish allyship. He was very familiar with Jewish support, and he had grown close bonds with his Jewish colleagues and his Jewish friends. This was not uncommon. Throughout the South, we saw this. We saw a tremendous amount of support for Jewish people and from Jewish people during the Civil Rights March.
So Southern Protestants are a bunch of Zionist dick riders, a bunch of Zionist cucks. That's what they are, man. That's what they are. Southern Protestants are Zionist cucks. They're Zionist dick riders.
Not celebrated, one of the most acknowledged and commemorated in tragic moments of the Civil Rights Movement, of course, with the death of James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, two Jewish people, one black person, who had been murdered in Mississippi as they struggled for justice. And so there's no doubt about these relationships, and in many ways, the relationship between blacks and Jews in the United States helped to amplify Dr. King's understanding of the plight of Israel. And Dr. King wasn't alone in advocating for Jewish people to have freedom, justice, and safety, not just in the United States, but around the globe, and at that moment meant Israel. Many black leaders of the 20th century, I mean, you could look at the black nationalist tradition, people like Marcus Garvey, people like W.E.B. Du Bois, who in 1948 wrote an important essay, The Case for the Jews, that he put in the Chicago Defender. In the newspaper in Chicago. I believe it was the Chicago Defender, but I'll make a note and find out. But
so notice the weasel words of Mark Lamont Hill. Notice the weasel words of Zionist grifter Mark Lamont Hill. Running cover for W.E.B. Du Bois. Running cover for Marcus Garvey. At the end of the day, Mark Lamont Hill's a Zionist, right? He does not serve the interests of the working class. He's a Zionist, he's a bougie Zionist academic. That's what Mark Lamont Hill is at the end of the day.
The point is, he made a case for Israel. He made a case.
And again, Mitchell Plitnick, Mark Lamont Hill's ties to Zionist Mitchell Plitnick and Zionist Breonna Joy Gray are why Mark Lamont Hill is running cover for Zionist Martin Luther King, right? That's the whole reason why.
For Israel. Initially, it was called Ethics and the Problem of Palestine, the Question of Palestine, that he'd written, and you can look in the archive and actually find the original notes to this. But Du Bois also supported Israel. Now, there were multiple reasons why people supported Israel, and I'm laying this out. Chicago Star was a Chicago Star, not Chicago Star. But these leaders, including King, believed, one, in the value and the power of nationalism. They believe that creating a collective national vision of Jewishness and Jewish identity was important, and they believe that Jewish people creating a nation state or a country, as it were, that would give them safety and protection was important. And for someone like Marcus Garvey, for example, that vision was especially important and inspirational as he was imagining a nationalist project for black folk. He was imagining what it would look like for black folk to do that same thing. And so there was a lot in there. The problem was, and the question was, what are the conditions under which this kind of thing gets created? Marcus Garvey.
Again, Mark Lamont Hill's a Zionist grifter, right? And he's just exposing himself as a Zionist grifter on YouTube.
He supported Zionism or the formation of Israel, sure. But he didn't support the erasure of Palestinian culture and life. He didn't support settler.
No, by supporting the Zionist entity, he literally supported genocide and settler colonialism. Again, look at who Mark Lamont Hill wrote his book with. Except for Palestine, Mitchell Plitnick is a literal, this endomorphic Zionist clown, Mitchell Plitnick, is a literal Zionist. Literal Zionist, right? That's what he is, man. And he brags about it on LinkedIn. And then you also look and, oh, he has ties to Zionist operative Gila Svervsky of B'Tselem and Zionist Mike Amitai, who has ties to George Soros, right? You look at who he's worked for, man. Freelance writer, Vice President, Foundation for Middle East, Director, B'Tselem, Director of Education and Co-Policy Director, JVP, University of Maryland School for Public Policy, Masters of Public Policy Management and International Security, Bachelor of Arts, Near East and Middle Eastern Studies, primary focus on Palestine, including honors thesis on the Zionist entity and Jewish, University of California. It's no secret that these two guys collaborated with each other because why? Mark Lamont Hill is a Zionist grifter. And I think the fact that he wrote the book of Except for Palestine with Mark Lamont Hill, or with Mitchell Plitnick, is important to this video and important to understanding that Mark Lamont Hill is a Zionist grifter.
Colonialism, he didn't support kind of violent expansion of an Israeli settler state or an ethno state. That wasn't what he was talking about.
Was it? Because we see Martin Luther King's words clearly here, man. MLK was a Zionist. MLK supported genocide against Palestine. MLK literally supported genocide against Palestine. Mark Lamont Hill is a liberal Zionist.
So we have to be very clear when we say somebody supported Israel. Did Dr. King support Israel? Yes. That doesn't make him a Zionist.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does, you moron. The existence of the Zionist entity is Zionist in itself. Much like MLK, Mark Lamont Hill is a Zionist, right? Look at his ties to Mitchell Plitnick, right? And look at Plitnick's ties to, the fact that Plitnick worked for the Foundation for Middle East Peace, B'Tselem, and JVP, the degrees, the Masters of Public Policy Management and International Security from University of Maryland, and the Bachelor of Arts and Near Eastern Studies from the University of California. And then his ties to, check it out, his ties to Zionists such as Angela Rye, Gila Svervsky, and Mike Amitai, who obviously have ties to the deep state apparatus in D.C. What does that indicate to us, right? right? And the fact that Mark Lamont Hill calls for a binational state but opposes the extradition of Zionist squatters, that indicates to us that Mark Lamont Hill is a Zionist. Also, Mark Lamont Hill is a bougie academic. He hasn't done a real job in his entire life, right? He's an academic and he's affiliated with the Green Party. That's two more red flags there. He's liberal Zionist, hasn't done a real job. He hasn't worked a real job in his life, man. He hasn't done a working class job in his life.
And let's be very clear also when we define these terms. Was Dr. King a Zionist? If we're defining Zionism as political Zionism, the actual project that begins at the end of the 19th century, that ultimately leads to the formation of a Jewish state in Israel at the expense of the civil and religious rights, the safety, the dignity, the self-determination of Palestinian people, then no, Dr. King was absolutely not a Zionist. Now, you can define Zionism in lots of ways. There are cultural Zionists, there are all kinds of Zionists, right? But if we're talking about the functional, operative, practical, lived reality of Zionism in the world for the last 100 plus years, then no, Martin Luther King Jr. was absolutely not a Zionist. He did not support it.
Yes, he was. What did MLK say about the Zionist entity? MLK ran cover for the Zionist entity and Zionist squatters, right? MLK ran cover for the Zionist squatters, right? MLK ran cover for the Zionist entity and for Zionist squatters, right? And you have a bunch of revisionists who run cover for MLK, right? So it turns out that Martin Kramer guy is that's linked here is a Zionist criminal, Zionist squatter himself. So the fact that Zionist squatters and Zionists are praising Martin Luther King, what does that tell us about Martin Luther King? Martin Luther King was a Zionist, right? Martin Luther King loved settler colonialism. He loved genocide. That's who Martin Luther King was, and that's what he tells us with his own words. Mark Lamont Hill is a Zionist grifter and a clown. That's what Mark Lamont Hill is.
Formation of an ethno state. He did not support the.
He literally did, man. Like, check his words, man. Check what words did he say with his own mouth. Look, Martin Luther King ran cover for the Zionist entity. Martin Luther King ran cover for the Zionist entity and for Zionist squatters, right? So why is the King Center working in collaboration with Zionist criminal Martin Kramer? We're going to figure that out, but first we're going to tackle this issue. Martin Luther King was a Zionist. Mark Lamont Hill is a Zionist and a grifter.
Inclusion of Palestinian people. He did not support the appropriation of Palestinian land. He did not support violence. Let's begin by saying Dr. King was an anti-war activist. So no, Dr. King didn't support.
Was he, or was he just an opportunistic grifter? Because to me it looks like MLK was an opportunistic grifter.
Support violent expansion. Dr. King was a pacifist. He didn't just support peace as a philosophy, or as a tactic rather. He supported peace as a philosophy, as an overarching approach to life. There is no way that he would look at the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza and say this is okay.
But what about occupied 1948 Palestine? Right? What about occupied 1948 Palestine, where a lot of my family is from? Where a lot of my maternal grandpa's family is from? Right? What about places like Daliat el-Karmal, Isfia, places like that in occupied 1948 Palestine? What about places like that? What about Palestinians in occupied 1948 Palestine? Again, look, I'll pull up my DNA test. I have it right here. So, right, 15%. 15% of my ancestry is from the area around Daliat al-Karmal and Isfia. So check it. Here's Palestine. Right around here is Daliat al-Karmal, and Isfia is slightly to the north of it. It's a suburb of it. That's where my maternal grandpa's family came from. That area in Isfia and Daliat al-Karmal is where my maternal grandpa's family came from, right? And then the other branch of my maternal grandpa's family is from like down here in Al Khalil, right? So that's where my people come from, is Daliat al-Karmal and Isfia. And as you can see, Palestine includes the West Bank, Gaza, and occupied 1948 Palestine, right? Mark Lamont Hill does not address the question of occupied 1948 Palestine, of places like Daliat al-Karmal, places like Isfia, places of that nature. Mark Lamont Hill doesn't address that because Mark Lamont Hill is a Zionist. Mark Lamont Hill is a liberal Zionist. That's what he is. At the end of the day, that's what he is. And that's why he writes books with Mitchell Plitnick. He's a grifter. Mark Lamont Hill is a liberal Zionist grifter. That's what he is.
No way he would look at the violent expansion of the Israeli state and say this is okay. This is not what Dr. King's vision was. This is not what Dr. King's articulated.
Even though Martin Luther Clown said in his own words, even though Martin Luther King said in his own words that he was a Zionist, again, Mark Lamont Hill is a Zionist gatekeeper and Zionist grifter. Mark Lamont Hill is trying to gaslight you.
Politics was. And people are saying, well, you're trying to attach to Dr. King a bunch of stuff when in reality, all you got to do is look at Dr. King's words.
That's literally all you have to do is look at Martin Luther King's words.
Okay. Let's look at Dr. King's words. First, let's look at his words around. Let's look at Dr. King's words around Israel in particular. Because I don't want you to think that I'm somehow jumping around and avoiding the obvious because it doesn't fit my agenda. Right? I want y'all to actually.
But you're trying to gaslight us. That's the thing, man.
To hear what Dr. King himself said on these issues, and then we'll come back and talk about it. Here's Dr. King on the question of Israel and on the question of anti-Semitism.
That Israel must exist and has the right to exist and is one of the great outposts of democracy in the world.
My Jewish brothers and sisters said to me amid anti-Semitism anywhere, we don't need your support. We have enough Jewish power to deal with this problem ourselves. I would still take a stand against anti-Semitism because it's wrong, it's unjust, and it's evil. If my Catholic brothers and sisters said to me amid bigotry toward Catholics, we don't need your support in this because we have enough Catholic power to deal with it. I I would still take a stand against bigotry toward Catholics because it is wrong, it is evil, and it is unjust.
Hola, me llamo Román. Desde que nací me he fracturado más de...
Notice how MLK didn't mention Islamophobia. It's almost as if MLK was an Islamophobe. It's almost as if MLK was a Zionist. It's almost as if MLK was an Orientalist. MLK's own words speak for themselves. Mark Lamont Hill is a Zionist grifter.
Right to exist and is one of the great outposts of democracy in the world.
You heard this. I'm just saying it again. So here you go. So Dr. King says a couple things here. I'll start with the second. I'll start with the second part first.
Yeah, because he's a chicken and he doesn't want to address the first part. MLK was a Zionist.
King says that he opposes anti-Semitism, and he said
This guy's a chicken, man. Hey, Mark Lamont Hill, I challenge you to a jiu-jitsu match, man. Because you're a Zionist clown, you're a dick rider for Zionist MLK, and you're a chicken. Okay? And that's why Mark Lamont Hill is too chicken to address what MLK said about the Zionist entity.
that even if there were enough Jewish power to stop anti-Semitism on its own, again, the language of Jewish power, he wasn't being anti-Semitic. You know, he was simply, which is why the next time he says Catholic power, he's simply saying if Jewish people had the capacity to stop anti-Semitism, he would still fight with them because it's the right thing to do. He said if Catholic people could stop,
Because MLK was a Zionist puppet, dude. Again, Mark Lamont Hill is one of the biggest clowns. One of the biggest clowns on supposed left-wing YouTube. Mark Lamont Hill is an Islamophobe, an Orientalist, and a Zionist.
anti-Catholic bigotry on their own. There was enough Catholic power to do so. He would still stand with them because it's the right thing to do. So yes, Dr. King opposed anti-Semitism. That is not the same thing as opposing. I'm sorry, he opposed anti-Semitism. That's not the same thing as supporting Zionism. So let's lay that flat first, right? Second thing, Dr. King does say that Israel has a right to exist and that it is one of the great outposts of democracy.
Again, MLK sounds no different than Joe Biden, no different than Nancy Pelosi, no different than Donald Trump, no different than George Bush, no different than Mike Pence, no different than Richard Bruce Cheney. Right? MLK sounds no different than Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush. And neither does Mark Lamont Hill. Why? Because they're all Zionists. They're all Zionists. They're all funded by the same people. Again, Mark Lamont Hill is a bougie academic. Mark Lamont Hill works for the City University of New York City Graduate Center. Mark Lamont Hill has never had a real job in his whole life. He's worked as an academic his whole damn life. Academics are enemies of the people.
Now, this is an important conversation to have. This is an important piece here. One, we have to begin with a basic rejection of a logical fallacy. And that is to say that just because Dr. King says it doesn't make it correct.
So, again, Mark Lamont Hill's a Zionist. Mark Lamont Hill has lost all of his credibility with the pro-Palestine movement. Honestly, most of his audience is a bunch of, like, white, suburban, German-American Lutherans and, like, white, suburban Russian Jews in Los Angeles, right? Like, actual Palestinians don't respect Mark Lamont Hill anymore.
We have to begin there too, right? Dr. King saying that Israel is one of the great outposts of democracy doesn't make it a great outpost of democracy. It speaks to Dr. King's vision, and it speaks to Dr. King's position.
And what was Dr. King's vision and position? Martin Luther King was a Zionist. Martin Luther King was an Islamophobe and an Orientalist. This is what Dr. King believed. This is what Martin Luther King believed. And again, he wasn't no doctor. He didn't have no MD. That's a real doctor. He was a schmuck doctor. MLK was a schmuck doctor, right? Right? Look at this. MLK ran cover for Zionists and Zionist squatters and the Zionist entity, right? As a Palestinian whose family's from occupied 1948 Palestine, Martin Luther King was a Zionist clown. Martin Luther King supported settler colonialism and genocide in Palestine. Mark Lamont Hill is trying to gaslight you.
And I think we have to acknowledge that that was his position. But let's not use that as evidence that it's true. That's what we call an appeal to authority. Dr. King said it, so it has to be true. No, it doesn't have to be true. Dr. King could be wrong.
And Martin Luther King on most things was wrong, right?
Dr. King was wrong. Similarly, if Dr. King had spoken up and said Israel is a settler colonial apartheid state, Zionists wouldn't be out right around saying, well, you know what, Dr. King said it, so we have to reject Israel now, right? They'd say Dr. King was wrong, or they'd probably call him an anti-Semite. So we can't appeal to the logical fallacy. No, we can't appeal to the logical fallacy. Agreement of 47, several different statements, interesting statements about Israel and about Zionism.
So this is basically who Mark Lamont Hill is, right? He's a Zionist. He's a clown.
We have to begin there too, right? Dr. King saying that Israel is one of the great outposts of democracy doesn't make it a great outpost of democracy. It speaks to Dr. King's vision, and it speaks to Dr. King's position, and I think we have to acknowledge that that was his position. But let's not use that as evidence that it's true. That's what we call an appeal to authority. Dr. King said it, so it has to be true. No, it doesn't have to be true. Dr. King could be wrong. Dr. King was wrong. Similarly, if Dr. King had spoken up and said Israel is a settler colonial apartheid state, Zionists wouldn't be out right around saying, well, you know what, Dr. King said it, so we have to reject Israel now, right? They'd say Dr. King was wrong, or they'd probably call him an anti-Semite. So we can't appeal to the logical fallacy. No, we can't appeal to the logical fallacy of saying because Dr. King said it, we have to agree with it. But we do have to say if Dr. King said it, that's what Dr. King said. We have to be honest and have fidelity to Dr. King's words. So when Dr. King said...
And by running cover for Zionist Martin Luther King, Mark Lamont Hill is being dishonest.
Is that Israel has a right to exist. Many people use that as an affirmation of Zionism, that Dr. King says Israel has a right to exist. What does right to exist discourse mean in 1967?
Same thing as it means today, right? MLK was a Zionist. And I know the revisionists like to run cover for MLK, but let's face the truth, man. MLK was a Zionist. MLK supported genocide and settler colonialism in Palestine. Mark Lamont Hill is a massive dick rider for MLK. He is a massive apologist for MLK. That's what he is.
Or even earlier, he speaks about Israel first, I believe in 1959. You can hear him talking about it when he gives a sermon on Easter about a walk through the Holy Land. And from 1959 to 1964 to 1965 to 1967, Dr. King has given several different statements, interesting statements, about Israel and about Zionism. I see some people in the comments saying, you haven't proven that he opposes Zionism. Dr. King doesn't stand up at any moment and say, I oppose Zionism. That's true. Dr. King also doesn't stand up at any moment and say, I am a Zionist, which is also
No, by supporting the Zionist entity, MLK was a Zionist. Mark Lamont Hill basically outs himself as a Zionist here.
so what's attached to him. So what we're doing is we're taking his words, we're taking his speeches, we're taking his philosophy, we're taking his actions, and we're assessing what that means. So Dr. King absolutely believed in Israel's right to exist. He says this in 1967, in August of 1967, I believe. And we have to ask the question, what does that mean in 1967? Now, you may say you're being technical here. Well, no, we're being precise. I can't take a meaning from 2024.
Again, this guy's an academic, liberal Zionist, collaborates with liberal Zionists with ties to George Soros. This guy's never worked a day in his life. He's a lazy academic. He's a desk jockey. And academics are enemies of the people. Mark Lamont Hill is a Zionist grifter. That's what he is. Mark Lamont Hill will sell you out in a jiffy.
Or a meaning from 1984 and assign it to 1964, 1967. And so I'm going to go to one of the trolls here just for a moment because it's an important point he's making. He's wrong, but he's making a point. He says, MLK words are only supporting the existence of the Jewish state. That is everything Zionism. This is why...
Again, MLK was a Zionist. MLK was an Orientalist. MLK was an Islamophobe. And so was Mark Lamont Hill.
This is why it's important to have these distinctions, right? Dr. King said nothing about supporting the Jewish state. He said that Israel has a right to exist. In 1967, the right to exist was a direct response to the 1967 war. For those who don't know, and I'm not trying to assume a lack of knowledge from anyone here, but different people are at different learning and developmental stages. So just that's why I'm saying.
So he calls his audience stupid, insinuates his audience is stupid, and runs cover for the Zionists. Right? Mark Lamont Hill ran cover for the Zionists. This is who Mark Lamont Hill is. Like, why do you think he wrote a book with Mitchell Plitnick, who is a liberal Zionist and a DC think tanker, right? And has ties to George Soros, ties to B'Tselem, all these nefarious ties down in DC, or out in DC, or over in DC, however you want to say it. Mark Lamont Hill is a Zionist grifter.
In 1967, there was a major war. It was the second major war. You could argue third if you count the Suez Crisis and in the tripartite aggression of 56. But in terms of the major sort of internal war, 1967 is the second major war. It's the war after which Israel not only continued to maintain the extraordinary amount of land that it accumulated in the 1948 war, which was even more than the UN had allowed it to have in the partition agreement of 47. But in 1967, Israel began to occupy the West Bank. Israel began to occupy Gaza. Israel began to occupy the Golan. Israel began to occupy East Jerusalem. Israel took over a bunch of Arab land, a bunch of Palestinian land, but not...
So first of all, it's Palestine from river to sea, okay? The fact that Mark Lamont Hill is using 1967 and Martin Luther King and running cover for Zionists, that tells us everything we need to know about Mark Lamont Hill.
Not just Palestinian land. They took the Golan from Syria. They took the Sinai. They took Gaza from Egypt, etc., etc. So at that moment, the UN was attempting also to stop the violence and stop the war. And so there were two major UN resolutions that happened. Two major UN resolutions that happened. One was UN Resolution 338, which was a ceasefire. Everybody agreed to a ceasefire. That was the goal. The second was UN Resolution 242, which I'm going to show you right now. I see comments coming in. Many of you are way off base here. Dr. King, again, did not affirm what you're saying he affirmed. Dr. King did not say what you said he said. Danny, I'm coming up to your question next. I'm going methodically and slowly so that we can get everything, right? So we can get everything done. So I'm pulling up everything here. And again, many of you are taking what Dr. King says and extrapolating more or adding more to it. Let's take his words for what he said. I don't agree with Dr. King on everything he said about Israel, but it's important. To say what he did say, and it's important to say what he didn't say. Okay, so let's go there. Let me pull up something here that just came up that I think is important. This person says, MLK clearly stated that he fully supported Israel as the Jewish home and is the only outpost of democracy in the Middle East. That is the definition of Zionism. Again, that's not...
Again, that literally is the definition of Zionism. MLK was a Zionist. Mark Lamont Hill is a liberal Zionist grifter.
What he said. That's not what he said. He said he supported Israel's right to exist, and he did say that Israel was a great democracy, a great outpost of democracy. That is true. He said one of the great outposts of democracy. He did not say what you just attached. And I'm going to bring up what Dr. King said, not to be petty, but because, again, this is how Dr. King's legacy gets misrepresented. This is how Dr. King gets misrepresented, okay? So let's zoom in to what he actually said, right? Let's zoom into what he actually said, and then let's juxtapose that to what you're saying that he said, right? And this is how Zionist Hasbara works, right? Here's what Dr. King actually said. And this is why it's important to have facts. This is why it's important to have data. This is why it's important to have actual archival.
So you see here, this is literal Zionist propaganda that this guy, Mark Lamont Hill, is pushing, right? MLK was a Zionist, right? So check this. MLK was an Orientalist. MLK was an Islamophobe. MLK was a Zionist, right? This guy, Mark Lamont Hill, the bougie academic Zionist, is running cover for MLK, right? Mark Lamont Hill is a liberal Zionist, right? Mark Lamont Hill is a Zionist, and that's why he's running cover for MLK.
Information. Dr. King said, I think it is necessary to say what is basic and what is needed in the Middle East is peace. Peace for Israel is one thing. Peace for the Arab side of the world is another thing. Peace for Israel means security. And we must stand with all of our might to protect its right to exist, its territorial integrity. This is important. Right to exist for Dr. King meant territorial integrity. This isn't my interpretation of what he meant. This is what Dr. King says it meant.
So in other words, MLK was a Zionist. And by running cover for MLK, Mark Lamont Hill is a Zionist.
Right to exist means territorial integrity. He said, I see Israel, and never mind saying it, as one of the great outposts of democracy in the world. No, sir, as this commenter says, he says, it's the only outpost of democracy in the Middle East. King didn't say that. Read the quote yourself. Nowhere does he say it's the only outpost of democracy.
So this surfer turfer guy is a Zionist. But Mark Lamont Hill is also a Zionist, so this is basically Zionist on Zionist crime. And when Zionists fight among themselves, that's a good thing for Palestinian liberation. That's a good thing for Palestinian resistance. Because if you have if you have liberal Zionists like Mark Lamont Hill fighting with a conservative Zionist or a right-wing Zionist, neocon Zionist, like Surfer Turfer, that's good for Palestinian resistance. That's good for Palestinian liberation. Because if it's Zionist on Zionist crime, then we can take advantage of that and we can destroy the Zionists.
He never says that. That is a lie. He also says King clearly stated that he supported Israel as the Jewish home. He does not say that here. He does not say that here.
So, again, still, MLK was a liberal Zionist. Right?
King does not say that. King was not supporting an ethno-state. King was not
But by supporting the mere existence of the Zionist entity, he was supporting an ethno-state and ethno-terrorism. But again, look who Mark Lamont Hill collaborates with. He collaborates with Zionist Mitchell Plitnick, right? So are we really surprised?
Supporting the creation of a Jewish ethno-state. He was not supporting an apartheid state. He was supporting Israel's territorial integrity. Not the right to occupy, not the right to bombard, not the right to...
The Zionist entity was already occupied 1948 Palestine. Mark Lamont Hill is such a Zionist grifter. The Zionist entity was already occupied 1948 Palestine, where my family's from, right? So, what does that say about Mark Lamont Hill? Mark Lamont Hill is a Zionist and a grifter.
Siege, not the right to be an apartheid state. So, while you say King clearly stated that Israel is the Jewish home, his words contradict you. I'm disproving you with his words right here on the screen. You also said that he says it's the only outpost of democracy in the Middle East. That also is contradicted by what's on the screen. King didn't say what you said he said. Ironically, King says, and I hear you, Adam Khaled, you're entitled to your opinion on that. We may even agree. But that ain't what we're talking about. We're talking about what King said. We're talking about what King said. So King says, I'm sorry, I had to knock at the door. I'm traveling. I'm trying to tell housekeeping up. So anyway, so King, when he says Israel has a right to exist, what does King mean? What does King actually mean? King means territorial integrity. What does territorial integrity mean? I'm going to show you. Because again, this is about UN Resolution 242. This is UN.
So what about occupied 1948 Palestine, right? Check it. My family's from occupied 1948 Palestine. We're from a place called Daliyat al-Karmal and from another place called Isfia. I also have some family from Al-Khalil, but mostly from Daliyat al-Karmal and Isfia, so right up around here. Right? That's occupied 1948 Palestine, right? Palestine is from the river to the sea. Again, the Zionist entity already was occupied 1948 Palestine, right? And that's what, so Mark Lamont Hill is gaslighting those of us who are from occupied 1948 Palestine.
UN Resolution 242 from the Security Council, right? And what the resolution says, let me take this ridiculous troller off the screen now. He's been up too long. But y'all see what I mean, right? Like, people will just say that King said something and he doesn't actually say that. Or King will say this and they'll add this. King says Israel's a democracy, and he's wrong about that. But King says Israel's a democracy. We have to respect that King said that. But he didn't say it's the only democracy, right? You can't just add that, but that's what they do. They add all this sauce to it, right? But let's look at what UN Resolution 242 actually says. It's a security resolution that happens after the 1967 war, right? And it says expressing the Security Council developed this. Why? Because it was concerned about the war. It wanted to stop future wars. So 338 is a ceasefire, and 242 says.
And Mark Lamont Hill is a Zionist clown. Notice how it says recent conflict, how it doesn't talk about occupied 1948 Palestine, which is literally why we say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Right? Check it. Like, my family's legit from occupied 1948 Palestine. Google Daliat al-Karmal. Google Isfia. That's where my family's from. Right? Again, this doesn't even address occupied 1948 Palestine.
I'm gonna enlarge the text for those like me who can't see. Expressing its continued concern with the grave situation in the Middle East, the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war, and the need to work for a just and lasting peace in which every state in the area can live in security. King was endorsing the UN resolution.
And the UN resolution was Zionist, therefore MLK was a Zionist. You low IQ moron.
Y'all are saying, well, King didn't say anything about a UN resolution. Well, let's look. King said we must terminate the termination of all claims or states of belligerency and respect for and acknowledgement of the sovereignty and territorial integrity and political independence of every state in the area and their right to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries. What does this mean? It means after the previous World War II, right, had ended in 1945, the idea, and really even after World War I, when the League of Nations was crafted, the idea was that you can't win a war and take people's land. You can't win.
What happened in 1948, bro? What did the Zionists do to Palestine in 1948? Right? Why do you think there is occupied 1948 Palestine? Right? Again, Mark Lamont Hill is gaslighting all of us 48ers, all of us whose families are originally from occupied 1948 Palestine. Mark Lamont Hill is gaslighting us, right? My family's literally from occupied 1948 Palestine. That's what he's doing. That's what Mark Lamont Hill is doing. He's gaslighting. Check it. So the truth said it should be acknowledged. Yeah, the truth is a liberal Zionist. And I'm not Mephisto. Says he literally said he supported the right of the Zionist entity to exist, man. This is a stretch to the point I think you're trying to gaslight us. That doesn't mean he supported an apartheid state before he died, before the Zionist entity took its final form in 2006. Saying that he's not a Zionist is exactly the opposite of what he said. Right? And Nito Benbon says, I totally believe that on face value. What? How? No. Nito Benbon is a liberal Zionist as well. Let's see. So, yeah, Samantha Iyer says, I'm not convinced from this that MLK wasn't a Zionist. Though I imagine, no, I don't think he would have changed his views. And Ta-Nehisi Coates is a Zionist clown. King's statement about the Zionist entity turning the desert into a land of brotherhood and democracy belittles the centuries of Palestinian history before 1948. It also ignores the fact that Palestinians who were in occupied 1948 Palestine lived under martial law and could have their land and homes confiscated, stolen. Let's use the right word, stolen from them under present absentee laws. Right? She says, we can accept that King was a man, not an infallible being. So several people obliterated MLK in the Mark Lamont Hill and MLK in the comments. And the masculinist POVs, the Zionist question is where I start questioning King as opposed to Malcolm X, Rahimahullah. The consistency of Malcolm was incredible. The Zionist question contradicts all what King stood for, even for the time. And John says, I'm tired of listening to colonizers whining about the land they stole. And I said, this is what I said. I said MLK was a liberal Zionist grifter.
Win a war and take people's land. I'm going to say it one more time. You can't win a war and take people's land.
Again, Mark Lamont Hill is a liberal Zionist grifter. Look, my family is from occupied 1948 Palestine, right? And specifically the area around Dalit al-Karmal and from Ispia, which is a suburb of Dalit al-Karmal, right? Mark Lamont Hill is gaslighting those of us who are from occupied 1948 Palestine. He's gaslighting us 48ers. So, yeah, Mark Lamont Hill's a liberal Zionist.
And so the idea here was, in the aftermath of 1967, that the right to exist simply meant that you had to recognize the territorial integrity of every nation. It doesn't mean you have to respect that nation's right to exist as it is. I don't have to respect China's right to exist as a communist state. I don't have to respect America's right to exist as a republic. I don't have to respect the UK's right to, England's right to exist as an Anglican state. In other words, but what we can't do is take their land. What we can't do is not respect the sovereignty and the territorial integrity. You think it's a coincidence? You think it's a coincidence that King used the word territorial integrity? The exact same language of UN Resolution 242, of course.
Again, this guy's a Zionist. He's a circus clown. Mark Lamont Hill's a Zionist, an Islamophobe, and an Orientalist. And that's why he writes books with Zionists like Mitchell Plitnick, right? This guy, the same one who has ties to B'Tselem and to George Soros, vis-a-vis Mike Amitai and the Open Societies Foundation. The guy that's a DC think tanker Never worked a real job in his life.
It's not. King was saying that we have to respect Israel's right to exist, meaning we can't go in and blow it up. Meaning that we can't go in and take it. Now again, you may not agree with King. We don't have to agree with King because he said it, but we can't pretend that King didn't say it, and we can't take anything away from King's words, and we can't add anything to King's words. So listen to what I'm saying. Hear what I'm saying. Martin Luther King Jr. was not saying, I see this person who commented before is still going. I'm going to start ignoring you now. Because the one thing you haven't done is acknowledge that what you said was complete.
Again, Mark Lamont Hill is a liberal Zionist. He's a liberal Zionist academic. Mark Lamont Hill supports genocide in Palestine. Mark Lamont Hill opposes extraditing Zionist squatters. Look at the words of Martin Luther Clown, Martin Luther Cuck, Martin Luther King, right? Martin Luther King literally runs cover for the Zionist entity. He also has a statement where he runs cover for Zionist squatters, right? Martin Luther King supported genocide. Martin Luther King supported settler colonialism. That's who Martin Luther King was. And Mitchell Plitnick is trying to gaslight us all. Mitchell Plitnick's trying to gaslight us all. Mark Lamont Hill's trying to gaslight us all. So Mark Lamont Hill's trying to gaslight you. Mitchell Plitnick is trying to gaslight you, right? So again, you can't trust him. You literally can't trust him, right?
Completely false. You went through all that about how King clearly said this and that. You were disproven with text, and you ain't acknowledged that point. So
again, this guy's a liberal Zionist. He's a liberal imperialist. That's what Mark Lamont Hill is, and that's what the receipts show it. So again, look, he's calling for the partition of Somalia, right? He's got this Zionist, Norman Finkelstein, on his show. So he clearly has an established pattern of behavior of promoting Zionists, right? He's a grifter and an opportunist. Praises liberal Zionist Bernie Sanders, who lived on a kibbutz. Has stupid ass videos. Calls what's going on in Palestine a conflict instead of a genocide. He has all the makings of a liberal Zionist grifter, right? And I want to go on to bad faith because
you think you know what
he affiliated himself with. Let's see. He was on Bad Faith as well. I want to find this. Again, you can see Brianna Joy Gray is a Zionist grifter. I want to see, where is Mark Lamont Hill? I think this was from like 2011 because this was still when Virgil, she was affiliated with Virgil, Texas. Yeah, Brianna Joy Gray is a grifter just like Mark Lamont Hill. Martin Luther King III. Oh,
is currently Bernie Sanders' foreign policy advisor. And
movement, all of the kind of rhetoric that you hear about it, what is their
values and not be sort of challenged by these popular boycotts? He was saying that specifically in response to an attempt to this kind of growing discourse around criminalizing BDS, around challenging people who oppose BDS, even in some states like Texas. There'll be people who are applying for school district jobs and they have to sign waivers in order to get jobs. All this stuff is
Mark Lamont Hill is trying to play both sides of a genocide. Mark Lamont Hill is a liberal Zionist.
Be dismantled. It's about how American politics works, and it's some of the forces, some of the structures, some of the laws, some of the norms, some of the cultural practices.
He was from Oklahoma. He's no
active hate, a hate movement, all of the kind of rhetoric that you hear about it.
Again, Brianna Joy Gray is a Zionist clown, and that's why you can't trust her. And that's why she associates herself with Zionists like Mark Lamont Hill and Mitchell Plitnick.
What is their good faith argument for that, and what should people...
Any kind of criticism of Israel? The first part of that argument is always, well, Israel is the only Jewish state, and it's getting singled out, and it's getting attacked in this way. And that is something that immediately puts people on the defensive. I want to, so years ago, just before I met Mark, I was working at the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I was the vice president. The president at that time was Matt Duss, who is currently Bernie Sanders' foreign policy advisor. And Matt one day was called to testify at a House subcommittee hearing about BDS. And before Matt could even get through his testimony, a Republican senator, representative who, forgetting his name, Russell, I believe his name was, he was from Oklahoma, he's no longer in Congress, basically tore into Matt based on a scurrilous article that a right-wing newspaper had written about his family.
So the fact that Mark Lamont Hill is associating himself with Matt Duss tells you everything you need to know about Mark Lamont Hill. And then Mark Lamont Hill is a grifter.
He was attacking Matt's father. He was attacking Matt's brother, and also Matt himself. And I'm watching this on C-SPAN, and my chin just hit the floor.
Ain't nobody watched C-SPAN that's a working class person.
Stephen Russell?
Yes, that was Steve Russell, right? And he basically was saying, you're an entire family of anti-Semites, and then he said, I have nothing to hear from you, and got up and left the hearing. I called some folks, friends of mine, who had been working in Washington for many, many years, not just on this issue, and no one had ever seen anything like it. It was unprecedented. It was unheard of. I mean, and it was something, I think, straight out of, I think you'd have to go back to the McCarthy hearings. So this scares people, right? And it becomes also a very powerful weapon. I think if you want to argue against BDS, you can. You can argue against any boycott movement. I am old enough to remember, I was in my 20s in the 1980s in the Reagan years. And I remember the arguments against boycotting South Africa, and they were many. They were not quite this. They were not exactly the same ones that you hear now about Israel. But we look back now and we ask, how could you possibly argue against that? Even conservatives wouldn't try to make that argument anymore. That fight has been lost. But people, you can make those arguments, and I think it's I may disagree. I may even think it's bigoted, but you can legitimately make those arguments. Yet they're not trying to. And the reason I feel like the opposition to BDS, rather than making an argument about why Israel should not be boycotted, attacks the movement and the people behind it, is because that is just a much more effective argument, because if you try and actually attack the reasons for BDS and the idea of BDS and defend Israel, you have to defend Israeli policies, which deny people's rights. And of course, the other part of that is you also get to a point where, very quickly in these arguments, it immediately becomes about you want to destroy Israel, you want to kill all the Jews in Israel, you want to do, all of these horrible, horrible things that bring up terrible images in people's heads. And that's actually not true. What this movement is about, and certainly there's a lot of angry rhetoric, and it's not limited to the pro-Israel side at all. But the BDS movement, again, oppose it or support it, but it's about Palestinian rights. It's not about, framing the argument as being anti-Israel. It's not anti-Israel unless you believe that the basic civil and human rights of Palestinians is by definition anti-Israel. And I reject that. I do not think that that the rights of Palestinians can only happen at the expense of the rights of Israeli people. But certainly, yes, Palestinian rights have to be achieved through some major changes to the way Israel does business.
So notice how Plitnik doesn't talk about Palestinian liberation. Notice how he runs cover for the Zionist entity, and how he opposes the extradition of Zionist squatters, how he opposes Palestinian liberation. And notice how Mark Lamont Hill just nods along in agreement. That's who Mitchell Plitnik is at the end of the day. And that's who Mark Lamont Hill is at the end of the day. And they're both liberal Zionists.
So one of the, framing ideas...
And this circus clown right here, Brianna Joy Gray, is also a liberal Zionist.
That you interrogate at the start of the book is the way that this notion of, this question of, does Israel have a right to exist, ends up being kind of an initial question that starts all of these arguments in this kind of defensive territory. And you walk through this history of folks, Zionists, including Zionists, who said, well, why do I even have to defend that? It's like, by even making me ask that question or talking about it in that way, you're kind of presuming there's a world in which Israel shouldn't exist, and I think that is a disempowering statement. But now it feels to be the predominant view is that by putting out there, it's starting with the question, does acknowledge Israel has the right to exist? It presumes that there are people who don't, and that the fight is about this kind of existential issue, as opposed to centering a conversation about Palestinian rights separate and apart as though it's not a zero-sum game. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of layers to this. So
and notice how Brianna Joy Gray ran cover for the Zionist entity in that question.
I think a slice of part of it. The first question is, what does it mean for a nation state to have a right to exist? That's the first question, right? Do states have a right to exist in general? Not Israel in particular, because I think if we only isolate Israel, if we only spotlight Israel, that's a very different and somewhat dangerous territory to enter. But if we ask a broader philosophical...
So notice how he runs cover for the Zionist entity. Oh, you're singling them out. No, we're not singling them out. Right? We're not singling them out. Right? So Mark Lamont Hill accuses Palestinians of singling out the Zionist entity just by the way he frames that question.
Which is, do states have a right to exist, or do people have a right to exist? I think we have a different question. And then the second question is, do states have a right to exist in a certain way? For example, do we have the right to exist as a republic? Does Saudi Arabia or Iran have a right to exist in its particular sort of formation, right?
Notice how he said Saudi Arabia and Iran. That sounds a bit Orientalist and Islamophobic on the part of Mark Lamont Hill. Why single out Saudi Arabia and Iran? Now, I'm no fan of either of those countries. Saudi Arabia has turned Zionist. Iran is also Zionist, but more secretly. So why is he singling out Muslim countries? Why is Islamophobe, Orientalist, and Zionist singling out Muslim countries? Seems a bit strange, doesn't it?
What does it mean to be a constitutional monarchy? What does it mean to be a Jordanian state, right? Do they have a right to exist in those...
Constitutional monarchy, Jordanian state. Again, singling out Muslims.
Forms, or do they have a right? When we say that, are we talking about respecting their territorial integrity and their sovereignty? Right?
There he goes, territorial integrity, sovereignty, just liberal Zionist buzzwords again.
Those are different questions. The other piece is, who gets asked this question, right? The state of Israel is not on a regular basis asking Switzerland to affirm its right to exist, or asking the United States to affirm its right to exist. It's a question largely placed squarely on the shoulders of and at the laps of Palestinians. And again, if you're asking,
Notice how Mark Lamont Hill uses his weasel words to try to justify the Zionist entity and Zionist squatters.
Israelis have a right to exist? I would say absolutely. Israelis, Arabs, Palestinians, Jordanians, Libyans, Liberians, South Africans, Mexicans, whoever.
So notice that liberal Zionist gatekeeper Mark Lamont Hill supports settler colonialism in Palestine. He literally just said that he supports Zionist squatters' right to exist. Mark Lamont Hill is a liberal Zionist. Mitchell Plitnick is a liberal Zionist. Right? They're gaslighters, gatekeepers, and Zionists.
We all have a right to exist in peace, dignity, safety, freedom, and self-determination.
Notice how he's using liberal buzzwords. Mark Lamont Hill will sell you out in a jiffy because he's a liberal Zionist. And that's why he's friends with liberal Zionist Mitchell Plitnick. By the way, Mitchell Plitnick, when he was speaking, he looked like he was out of breath. That shows you how endomorphic he is.
And our Jewish brothers and sisters are no exception to that question. But the question becomes really, when people say a right to exist, what are they talking about? They're talking about the right to exist as a Jewish state. And the question becomes, another question then becomes, well, do you have a right to exist in that form? And what's at stake when you do? For some, it's a question of Jewish self-determination. And
again, Mark Lamont Hill is a liberal Zionist, and he runs cover for Zionists.
I think Jewish people, like all people, have a right to self-determination.
Well, that phrase is lobbied around a lot. What is meant by that?
Well, that's just it. That is the right question. That is the perfect question. And in many ways, that's why we say in the book, this then becomes a referendum, or at least an analysis, or demands an analysis of Zionism. Because as a political project, as an ideological project, sometimes
he stutters more than Shannon Sharp.
As a religious project. But the question is, when people say we have a right to exist, or a right to self-determination, and in this particular iteration of Zionism, right, political Zionism, which has been the dominant iteration of Zionism, there are all sorts of Zionists. Peter Beinart, the cultural Zionists, there are liberal Zionists out there.
And all forms of Zionism are genocidal. All forms of Zionism are illegal. They're banned, prohibited, haram, prohibido. Mark Lamont Hill is a liberal Zionist, and so is Mitchell Plitnick.
But the dominant iteration of Zionism has been the settler colonial project of political Zionism that emerges and really begins at the end of the 19th century with the first Aliyah, and continues throughout the 20th.
Academics are enemies of the people. Think tankers are enemy of the people. Mark Lamont Hill is a liberal Zionist, and so is Mitchell Plitnick. And they're both going to be in prison for genocide against Palestine when we liberate Palestine.
First century. And that project, that issue of self-determination has often been conflated not just with creating a Jewish nation, right, a kind of form of Jewish nationalism, but it's also been connected to the belief in forming a state, and a state where there is already an indigenous population there. Mm-hmm. Now, again, I'm not saying that there's not a Jewish presence in historic Palestine. There is, and there always has been. Long before 1882, long before the first Aliyah, long before the World Zionist Convention is conference.
Again, he spews more Zionist propaganda, and there's his little fat friend, Mitchell Plitnick, up there. This is why you can't trust Mark Lamont Hill.
We're not gonna let you just do this. So if there's a way to kick this person out, I don't know. I need to get a moderator in this thing. It's the longest in history. What does that mean? Gaza remains under effective control of Israel, even though Israel redeploys troops from inside of the Gaza Strip to the perimeter of the Gaza Strip in 2006.
Yeah, Mark Lamont Hill's a liberal Zionist. Mitchell Plitnick's a liberal Zionist. If you're writing a book with a fat ass Zionist like Mitchell Plitnick, then you're a liberal Zionist.